for joining us for today's webinar, Knowledge is Power, Psychoeducation with Youth and Caregivers Impacted by Trafficking. This webinar is brought to you by the National Center on Child Trafficking. The NCCT is a national collaborative of professionals who are developing trauma-informed interventions and resources to improve the lives of children and families impacted by sex and labor trafficking. This is the 5th webinar in an 8-webinar series, which reviews concepts from the NCCT's mental health treatment guidelines for youth who've experienced trafficking. Alongside the webinar series, we're running the NCCT Clinical Discussion Group, which offers an opportunity to discuss implementation of the guidelines into clinical work. Our upcoming CDG will be next Thursday, and you can find registration information in the chat. Our presenters today, Kelly Kinnish and Ricardo Rubiales, will be facilitating that discussion group, focusing on challenges and successes related to psychoeducation, as well as resource sharing. This graphic highlights 10 key elements of trauma treatment with youth impacted by trafficking. The mental health treatment guidelines offer recommendations in each area for mental health and substance use treatment professionals working with this population. Today's webinar will explore psychoeducation in mental health treatment of youth impacted by trafficking. The mental health treatment guidelines encourage therapists to utilize a range of learning methods and resources to provide individualized information in a developmentally matched way in order to enhance youth safety and foster growth. We're going to be talking today about several key topics that are important to address. And the guidelines also highlight how important it is to be collaborative and creative, offering psychoeducation in ways that are respectful and responsive to youth perspectives, interests, culture, and learning abilities and styles. When offering psychoeducation, we want to make sure that youth don't feel labeled or judged, or that we're making assumptions about them and their situation, but instead feel supported and empowered. So this is an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We'll start with an overview of the purpose of psychoeducation and why it's important when working with trafficked youth. And then our presenters are going to be offering some strategies for when and how to incorporate psychoeducation into treatment. We'll highlight some key topics that might be important, focusing on psychoeducation about trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, as well as covering some other important psychoeducation topics. And then throughout today's webinar, our presenters are going to be sharing some resources that might be helpful for psychoeducation with youth and caregivers impacted by trafficking. So I'm really pleased to welcome our presenters today, Kelly Kinnish and Ricardo Rubiales. Kelly Kinnish is the director of the National Center on Child Trafficking in the School of Public Health at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia. Previously, she was the director of clinical services at the Georgia Center for Child Advocacy and was also director of SAMHSA-funded Project Intersect and the OVC-funded Envision Project, both programs which focused on improving the well-being of youth who experience trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, with a particular focus on effective mental health interventions and collaborative service responses. Kelly has over 25 years experience working with maltreated and at-risk children and families in clinical, research, and administrative capacities. So thanks for being here, Kelly. And Ricardo Rubiales began working at the Christie House Child Advocacy Center in 2007, first as a therapist, then as a clinical supervisor for the therapy department, and then most recently returning as the director of Project Gold, a program that provides wraparound services for youth who've experienced or who are at risk of trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. He oversees clinical, employment and education, and trafficking prevention programming at Project Gold, supervising and providing direct care for individuals, families, and groups. He's trained in several evidence-based treatments and non-clinical service modalities and provides training and consultation on trauma and human trafficking. So welcome, Ricardo. Really happy to have you. So I want to just start off with this question for both of you. What is psychoeducation and why is psychoeducation important with youth who've experienced trafficking?
Thanks, Elise. I'll go ahead and start us off. Psychoeducation is generally understood, access to information about mental health and treatment to enhance understanding, coping, and overall well-being, and maybe a little bit more broadly, knowledge acquisition, new learning on a range of topics relevant to the client to foster growth, improve functioning, enhance safety, and support treatment engagement. So sometimes therapists, I think, could have a narrow and maybe even a boring view of psychoeducation, mostly explaining diagnoses and treatment. It's probably a stretch to say that I'm passionate about psychoeducation, but I do feel really strongly that there's a lot that's good for youth that comes from psychoeducation done well with creativity and attunement, and maybe with a little bit broader perspective, what might be included in it, what really happens in psychoeducation, and maybe kind of how psychoeducation can happen and be delivered. So I also think that, and as Ricardo and I've talked about, avoiding some pitfalls. Ricardo?
Yeah, so some common mistakes that clinicians make is making psychoeducation too didactic. We sometimes forget that the youth have their own experiences, their own knowledge, their own awareness. It's really important that we're not talking to them like if we're teachers, or talking down to them, or like if we're the only providers of information in their lives. You don't want it to be overly prescriptive or too cookie cutter, and just be kind of giving them information that they could just read on a piece of paper themselves. An advantage of not making it overly prescriptive or heavily didactic is that, you have an opportunity here to learn what they know. And it's a starting point, to get their perspectives, their beliefs, and understanding of things so that your psychoeducation could be accurate. Another important feature is that sometimes people think that psychoeducation is a one-time thing, or regardless of what modality of therapy you're using, it's supposed to just come at one place. The reality is that as you get to know the individual and their circumstances, which especially with trafficking can often change over time, there could be repeated occurrences or opportunities to provide psychoeducation depending on what new information you get as you get to know the individual, and also as their own context changes around them and within themselves. It's also very important that our psychoeducation is not coming from a place that's emotionally reactive or wanting to convince them of something, or we want the youth to feel like we are a safe, comfortable place, and hopefully our setting is as well, to be able to provide information, and again collaborate to whatever extent possible in just learning about what's going to be important for them. And the other piece is, psychoeducation is not about holding all responsibility for their actions, or even the actions of the trafficker. We want there to be a neutrality to it so that the person can feel comfortable engaging with us and give us a shot to provide them information and continue.
All right, tackling, I think, the second part of your question, at least, the why is it important? The title of the webinar speaks to this, and also this quote from Kofi Annan: "Knowledge is power. Information is liberating. Education is the premise of progress in every society and every family," and we would perhaps add for kind of every individual. So yeah, knowledge is power. Learning is empowerment, which is a core feature of trauma-informed care. It is empowerment, I think, that is especially important in working with trafficked youth, where deception, fraud, disinformation. Go ahead and next slide, Elise. When so much about the experience of trafficking is bound up in deception of the youth, fraud that's perpetuated, disinformation, deliberate withholding of information from trafficked persons, myths and misperceptions that they may have had that are perpetuated by their exploiters. These are all things that I think contribute to trafficking risk and harms, and so especially important that psychoeducation is countermanding these things. And so a for sure incomplete list of some of the ways that this manifests. So first, lies told by the exploiter about the relationship as part of recruitment, grooming, holding to an exploitive situation or retirement, often aided by a lack of knowledge or what are the hallmarks of a healthy relationship, whether that's romantic, familial, or even friendship relationships. For example, I love you. This is how people show love. If you love me too, this is how you'll show it. we're a family and what's bound up in that. Also lies that are degrading, shaming, blaming, especially again as overt strategies of the exploiter. This is all you're good for. You chose to do it. There's no going back now. Some of these deceptions. Promises of a better life. You'll make more money. You'll be safer. Safer. I'll look out for you. Threats based on lies, lack of knowledge, especially about laws and rights. So this might be, if I get arrested, you're going to get arrested too. You're part of it. If you go to the police, you'll be deported. And especially powerful, and I think if you threats to a child, if you leave me, I'll report you to Child Protective Services, and they'll take your, sometimes our, kid away. Ways that people are kind of disoriented in trafficking. So I was interviewing a youth who described that she was in a car and she had access to a phone and was texting her mother and sister, and she very much wanted them to come and get her, but she didn't know where she was because she had been moved around so much and was not in a place that she was familiar with. So again, these are often deliberate strategies. I think particularly in therapy strategies to in our work with youth, strategies that undermine trust in formal systems and other places of safety and support. So when they are told by an exploiter, they, meaning we, can't be trusted, this can be specifically about therapy and about therapists. So it may be directly contributing to distrust and engagement difficulties that we're having with use. And I think it also kind of reinforces a sense of isolation from people, from knowledge, that accentuates the youth dependence on their exploiter. So, again, not a complete list, but there's so much to be gained from supporting access to information, fostering youth curiosity, and modeling how to seek and acquire information with youth.
Yeah.
What about you? Some thoughts about
Sorry, go ahead.
just thoughts about the importance of psychoeducation?
I mentioned earlier, I used the word opportunity and collaboration, and psychoeducation is a great place to build trust. We've talked about the fraud and other tactics that are used to manipulate youth or leave them uninformed. This is an opportunity to build a trusting relationship where there is honest information given in a safe way. It's a great opportunity for engagement and rapport building, for collaborating, and even finding out what are things that you may not even be thinking about should be part of the psychoeducation that maybe they're interested in or would benefit them. In the end, as the quote indicated, knowledge is power. And if we do so in a collaborative way, in a safe way, in a neutral way, there's an opportunity for learning that would be ongoing throughout the course of whatever treatment or services you're providing.
So we're really talking about actually just really pushing back against some of those harms related to trafficking, right? So recognizing that exploiters use disinformation, deception, fraud, disorientation, isolation to coerce youth, and that without accurate information or understanding, youth aren't able to make informed decisions. So I think it's a great point that you guys are both making about that knowledge becoming a means of empowerment and opening up opportunities for growth for these young people. I want to switch us over a little bit. And so thinking about, given that and the purpose of psychoeducation, can you give us some guidance about offering psychoeducation to trafficked youth and their families? What suggestions do you have for how to offer psychoeducation, what pitfalls to watch out for and how to avoid them, when to incorporate psychoeducation into treatment? And some points that we talked about in advance that Kelly and Ricardo brought up are fostering engagement, leading with curiosity, avoiding assumptions, labeling, and judgment, individualizing psychoeducation to the youth, and then considering timing and pacing. So we'll just talk about some of these different areas. And Kelly, do you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, so making it engaging, I have a few angles on this. So first, youth who have experienced trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation can be a pretty significant challenge to engage. And this is usually very much grounded in a long history of failed and disrupted treatment. There's not much that we can do about the experiences that they have had, but they're coming in, they're not wrong to have this kind of low expectation of us and a disinterest in committing again or hoping for better this time. So it's often pretty essential to be doing everything that we can to make all aspects of our treatment more engaging. Our best clinical skills and creativity, Carter's going to say a lot more about some specifics there that can really enhance it. We just really have to be bringing our A game to every session because, again, there is just often a difficulty engaging that it's not about us, but we're just going to have to, work harder often because of the experiences that they've had. I think that Ricardo also kind of made the point that, not only is it important that we make it more engaging, but it's also, psychoeducation can be a powerful engagement tool, really kind of engagement gold. It can be an engagement strategy in its own right, in that providing helpful information to a youth that is useful to them, that is of interest to them, kind of is an engagement strategy. So it's important that we're kind of leveraging that as we might leverage kind of our opportunities at any of the elements of our treatment in every session. We're just, kind of bringing it all. I think an important starting place, I think, is actually the next one here, kind of leading with curiosity. I just think, engaging youth in the information seeking process and creating opportunities to demonstrate knowledge and mastery is pretty essential. Kind of asking, what do they already know about whatever it is that we're kind of thinking might be helpful? What else would you like to know about? Asking this of the youth, what would be helpful to you? And then I think importantly, let's find out together. So finding out what they already know keeps you from compromising engagement by spending time talking about things that the youth already knows. And they might be pretty polite about this. If in some ways their goal is just sort of like getting through the session, they might be perfectly comfortable just listening, being able to be in a passive way, listening to information that they've maybe heard from many times from a number of different therapists, right? And that's kind of that can really undermine our engagement efforts. So asking them kind of what they already know about things can be a really great place to start. And also, truthfully, most people like being able to share what they know. So creating opportunity for youth to demonstrate their mastery of some of these kind of informational topics that we think might be important, like that can be a win as well, to learn something that they already know quite a bit about, but giving space for them to share that with us. And then I think most importantly, though, let's find out together, whether stated or not, this is the orientation. In my mind, I always imagine that the youth and I are side by side seeking information together, not across from each other and me handing the information to them. I think, as Ricardo was saying earlier, I want to feel less like a teacher in that and more like it's something that we are kind of working together to go out and collaboratively find together the information that they're interested in. So.
Yeah, and doubling down on something that Kelly just said, and leading with curiosity, it's not on these bullet points right here, but not assuming that a youth doesn't already have knowledge and information, not assuming that what they know or have been told is necessarily all wrong. For ourselves, when we go into psychoeducation, it's really, really important for us to be aware of our own belief systems, generally speaking, or specific to trauma or specific to trafficking, and what our biases may be about these things. We want to avoid assumptions, labels, or judgment or blame. It's very common for people to feel like if someone has experienced trafficking, that all the trafficking was traumatic, that they identify as a person who has experienced trafficking, that they identify as a victim or a quote survivor. I've worked with many individuals who experienced trafficking and don't refer themselves as victims or survivors. That's kind of our jargon, and we don't want to impose that on other people. The other thing is that, as I mentioned, the idea that all the trafficking was traumatic. I've worked with a lot of youth that have had experiences, including relationships with traffickers, that have some sort of benefit to them. If you really think about it, trafficking as a form of exploitation is the exploitation of vulnerabilities and the exchange for something of value. What is of value is not for us to decide. What is of value could be perceived or actual. Someone may perceive the treatment that they're getting as care or protection or love, and we might view it as, well, no, they're putting you in danger, that's not love, et cetera, et cetera. Who are we to impose that belief on them? For anyone who's done trauma work outside of trafficking, you will know that a lot of times there is ambivalence and mixed feelings about the traumatic experiences, the different types of abuse, and towards the abusers. And traffickers, as a form of abuser, are not separate from that. There could have been good experiences leading up to the trafficking. There could have been, like I said, things that are of perceived value or benefit. It's not our job to label them in any type of way, just like we don't want to leave the trafficking or the trauma itself. We could provide information, and if we do it right over time, the psychoeducation will more so plant seeds than us feeding them information on a silver platter. Whereas they get more comfortable talking about their experiences, and hopefully they're in a safer place and not as exposed to it, or the trafficker or the individuals that were involved, where they might have some aha moments where things click for them about whether it, what was traumatic, whether they identify as victims or not. And I use this phrase a lot in training staff, perceiving the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I say that because a lot of times within abusive or traumatic experiences, including but not limited to trafficking, and with abusers, including but not limited to traffickers, there could be positive experiences or things that they might even miss when exiting the trafficking. We know there's a lot of recidivism with trafficking. There's reasons for that. And it's not, just circumstantial. Grooming and manipulation are real things. And those things sometimes sink really deep hooks into individuals. And these are relationships that are, for us, if we're just meeting someone, especially, but during the course of providing services or treatment, we're not a greater influence to them than the people that are already in their lives, abusers or traffickers or otherwise. And so we should treat that with some humility and be careful with our judgments and labels and such. We want to make sure that we're providing information that is factual and relevant to the person in context. Let's start off with factual. That goes back to the earlier point of checking our biases and beliefs. I think I've spoken to that quite a bit in terms of, those first two bullet points that sometimes make us present information that is not factual or in a not concrete and factual way. The other piece is the person and their context. We want to make sure that what we're providing is going to mean something to them. We don't want to turn into like this, blurred voice of just giving them a bunch of information that means nothing to them in their particular circumstances. And going back to an earlier slide, I talked about it not being a one and done thing, how psychoeducation could come throughout treatment. And that could often vary based on what the person's context is. They could be changing homes, residences. That's a very common thing where there's a lot of changes of placements, for example. How close there is proximity in actual time or space to people that were involved in the trafficking, traffickers, and otherwise. So we want to make sure that, with their current situation, what are their greater needs for information that would be meaningful for them, for us to give them something of value in case we never see them again, but also give them a reason to think like, you know what, I haven't been back in a couple of weeks, maybe I want to give Mr. and Mrs. a call. Just remember that the purpose is educating and informing, not trying to influence or convince them of anything. Even though you may view them and be serving them as a victim of trafficking, it is not our responsibility to convince them that they are that or influence their decisions other than provide them with information. The most influence we should have is for it to influence that they have options and information now to make better decisions, or at least be more understanding of the situations and systems surrounding them. Next slide, please.
Actually, can I add before? I just wanted to kind of highlight, I really appreciate what you said about the balancing, their experiences. And one, because it's practically never a successful strategy, for example, to try to convince an adolescent that their boyfriend is bad for them. Like that's how that is not often very successful. But the other part is like sometimes so much of the time people have been about trying to convince them that this relationship is bad for them, that sometimes a really helpful place to start is actually asking them about the things that you were talking about, Ricardo. What are the positives for them? What are the positive qualities of the relationship? And oftentimes it's not until we actually allow for space for that they might be willing to acknowledge some of the parts of it that maybe aren't as healthy or that might not be working for them as well. So I really appreciated that perspective.
Thanks, Kelly. So another area to kind of piggybacking off of the last bullet point is we really want to make sure that we're individualizing to the person and their context. So one of the things that comes up a lot of times is someone's developmental level in terms of cognitive or intellectual. That could be emotional maturity, social skills. Just think of, we could do a whole bunch of slides just about different types of development. A lot of times when youth are removed from what would be their typical living and growing up and development circumstances due to trafficking, due to changes of placements, where we could do an entire other seminar on the impacts of trauma on the development of the brain. So it's really important that we're also catering to the individual specifically where they are in terms of their development because of the impairments and struggles they may have in different areas. If a child has been frequently truant over the course of many years due to trafficking or other related traumas, it's possible that their development in skills they might develop through school have had an impact. So we want to really try and see where they're at. A perfect example would be, what is their learning style? What is their communication style as well? Some people do better with a handout. Some people do better with a conversation. Some people do better with looking at a web page. Individuals that might not be able to read might be able to benefit from things that have graphics or imagery. So you want to be able to think outside the box. The most important thing is that you're not doing psychoeducation the same for everyone. And yeah, there's going to be common themes and activities that repeat more than others, but you want to make sure that you don't have this sort of non-creative approach to the individual and how they learn, how they communicate. And a good starting point is also being able to utilize their interests and their strengths and their values. So if you are working with someone and you know that they have an interest in a particular thing, let's say a sport, music, or something else, you could cater the psychoeducation to be able to piggyback on something that's already of interest to them. What's going to make it less boring for sure. I love to use metaphors, arguably too much, because I think I sometimes, jump the shark there. But it's important that I feel like some of my most effective psychoeducation conversations over the years have been where I pick what do I want to convey? What do I think, again, what would be of meaning to them? Not because I want to convey it or because it means something to me, but what would be meaningful for them, but also put it in a format that's individualized to what would be meaningful for them in terms of what are their interests. I don't know anything about football, but it might be a metaphor about football, and the same thing, figuring out what are their strengths. Earlier on, Kelly and I have already talked about the importance of what they could bring to the table in terms of their knowledge and experiences, not assuming that they don't know things or that they have the wrong information. One of their strengths may be that they've actually figured things out on their own. Their strengths may include being creative in trying to understand things. Their strengths may include any of their given interests, and so we really want to be catering our psychoeducation to build on, I guess the theme here is what's already natural to them. Where do we have to maybe bob and weave and be creative or put different efforts in terms of what they might struggle with, or to make sure that it's getting across in a meaningful way. The other piece of it is they already have awesome things in their life. I say this in a lot of presentations and trainings. If they're sitting in front of you, something's working. If they're sitting in front of you or they came back to see you, unless you're in a lockdown residential facility, but even in that setting, if they're willing to sit down with you and have these conversations or do these activities, that by itself is a strength, and then what is of interest about that? So I talked about things that could be interests outside of the context of services or therapy, but how do these things combine and align with what you're trying to do, both in the content you're trying to provide and the way you're delivering it? What are their values? A lot of times what really clicks with psychoeducation isn't so much being given a definition as to what trafficking or abuse is or what trauma is. And again, people making assumptions or trying to convince someone that that's what it is. A lot of the best psychoeducation comes with aligning to their values. These could be just personal values, cultural, spiritual, whatever it is, where they may also then see, again, not from a convincing place or without making assumptions, where some of what was going on, not necessarily yet to be defined as victimization or trafficking for them, again, but maybe some of what was going on, they could recognize didn't line up with what their values about what for themselves or how they want to be treated by someone they put trust or that supposedly cares for them, is there to take care of them. So these are hugely important things, but they vary so much from one individual to the next. It's really important that you don't assume that because you're of the same faith or of you're the same neighborhood or you came from the same town or raised in certain ways, don't assume that there were common values across the board. And so you want to explore what's important for them, and really just from all the above, take it and come up with different strategies for how you're going to provide psychoeducation, when you're going to provide it, the how, the when. And I think the when takes us over to timing and pacing. So next slide, please. So recognize opportunities. Even if you have an intention, this kind of would go with other, skills and things that you might want to impart in your services. Sometimes you could have a perfect game plan and it's just not the day. Every play is not going to work every time. And so, but you could look out for opportunities to provide psychoeducation, meaningful for them and individualized to them as already discussed, but maybe sprinkled throughout the treatment or services provided. Again, it doesn't have to happen at the beginning. It doesn't have to be a one and done thing. It's often an ongoing, living, breathing, evolving thing. But you want to look out for opportunities where maybe there is an acknowledged lack of understanding or a curiosity. Earlier, Kelly talked about us leading with curiosity. Them having a curiosity or asking a simple question could be a great opportunity for you to open the door into having different activities or strategies that could provide psychoeducation. And they're just giving you, a small like peek into opening the door, and you could nudge the door open a little bit. But that works best if you're attuning to their interests, and their curiosities. So attune to the youth. What is it and when is it important for them? Why is it important for them? It's not just a one-time thing. It happens throughout. You want to make sure that you have different sources of information. It doesn't matter what, there are different modalities of treatment, and there's also different methods of providing psychoeducation. So we want to make sure that we're not fixed and rigid. We lead balancing, flexibility with fidelity. And you want to make sure that what you're doing isn't limited, because by definition, if we're providing psychoeducation, it's because we want to open doors, not close them. So keep your options varied and and recognize the varied opportunities to do so. And as always, prioritizing engagement and safety. What's going to be meaningful for them and a value for them to take home and a reason to come back. And if you have to pivot hard, really, really safety concerns are where that's at. Providing psychoeducation when someone is not in danger and calm is very important. Just like it's easier to learn how to take controlled breaths or deep breaths for relaxation, you want to practice that when you're not already irate or terrified. It's the same thing when you're addressing safety as part of psychoeducation, is that psychoeducation is an opportunity where, yeah, you might have to provide that routinely when there are risks and dangers or recent risky situations or recent crises or emergencies. But you also have opportunities to provide safety planning and safety skills related psychoeducation as part of your regular conversations, and sprinkling that in within the psychoeducation. One of the things I like to do is that, and this is something that I would say I do a bit more generically and encourage staff I supervise or train to do so, is that safety and safety related psychoeducation is something that is not only important because there's a history of trafficking and other risks, but safety can also be a coping skill. Safety can also be a way of ensuring that they could talk to you. And again, if you skip out on the assumptions and the judgments and labels, when you do address safety things, they will be more comfortable to talk to you about these things without feeling like you're just going to immediately pick up the phone and make a call to 911 or abuse hotline. That you're not necessarily going to have to react in a way that might be stigmatizing, and that we could create a place of safety and provide information that in the long term will hopefully keep them safe. And ideally, if we do these things between the, we're able to engage with them and create a safe space for them to come back and talk with us. Because if they come back with us feeling like we have a closed mind, why should they have an open mind? So there's an opportunity for them to have an open mind to the psychoeducation we're going to provide, and have an open mind to maybe there are some situations where I could look out a little bit better or have different safety planning strategies in place, or maybe recognize that someone in my life that I care about and I'm growing a relationship with or have had a historical relationship with, maybe there's situations with them which aren't as safe, and maybe I could tap out of those things sometimes. It's not all or nothing is a really important thing.
Roman, so when you were talking, I was thinking that part about kind of seeing opportunities, and I kind of love this notion. It's less about like the session that you have psychoeducation like scheduled, but it may be that the best time to kind of talk about maybe like the kids come in and they've had a fight and everyone's upset, and the focus is on like what they just got in trouble for, and they're coming in and they're describing, right? I lost it. I don't know what happened, right? Actually, that's maybe a better window to maybe sort of kind of consider talking about, especially if it was a reaction to something that happened that actually might be connected to something more like a trauma reminder. That's a pretty great opportunity to maybe introduce the topic of trauma, less so maybe more valuable, and maybe more when it's something that the kid's really motivated to learn more about in that moment. So anyway, I love that particular point. All right. So as we were preparing for this webinar, one of the things that Ricardo and I were pretty unified about, and has already kind of come up, I think, a few times, is that I think what we thought the most important thing to address is the goal of psychoeducation is not to convince youth of their trafficking victimization or elicit a disclosure from them. And to approach it in ways that's perhaps the most significant. To do so, I think, can really probably kind of undermine engagement, like Ricardo's already kind of touched on a fair amount. That doesn't mean we don't want eventually for youth to have a better understanding of their trafficking experience and the conditions that may have contributed to their vulnerability and ongoing risk. But we think it can be a real misstep to kind of in therapy, and especially psychoeducation, which is often approached fairly early in therapy, to view that as the goal of it, I think can really be a bit of a misstep. And so go ahead, Elise, Vance. So I think we've kind of touched on some of these points, but kind of more again, Ricardo, I think, on some of these threats to engagement from this approach.
Yeah, so a lot of youth that have experienced trafficking may not view their trafficking or exploitation as traumatic. In fact, a lot of times you don't always even have real clarity when you're working with the youth if they were almost trafficked or at risk of trafficking. A lot of times it would be a huge leap for us to just assert that even to begin with information. Investigations don't often provide much. Disclosures don't always happen. We could kind of know in our heart of hearts that someone has probably experienced trafficking. We definitely don't always know with 100% certainty. But again, we're not trying to force that on them. If we're trying to, going back to the earlier point, I'm not trying to convince people as part of psychoeducation. It's not the purpose of psychoeducation. Is there's a risk to the therapeutic relationship, because I don't think anyone wants to go somewhere and try to be convinced of something. To use a parallel again, I love metaphors. If I go to the doctor and he's talking to me about my health and weight, but it's coming from like a personal point, or he's trying to convince me of something, I'm going to respond to that less receptively than if he just provides me the lab results that show that there's a high risk factor or a concern there. I think that's why it's important for our psychoeducation to be neutral. When we address psychoeducation early in treatment, we want to be thoughtful, again, not to be redundant, but what is their current circumstance and what is important to them? Some people don't identify as victims. A lot of times, just like when you're working with kids of different ages with other types of trauma, especially intrapersonal traumas like the different types of abuse, a lot of times there is a responsibility people take in terms of whether something was consensual or not. And that could vary from, with other types of trauma in terms of, regular sexual abuse. It could just be a difference between, age of consent, but they really believe that the situation was consensual. When someone doesn't have a full understanding of trafficking just on a basic level in terms of vocabulary and definitions or the laws, but you incorporate with that they may be engaged in activities in which they're being trafficked but don't know. You know, a perfect example would be if someone is forced to or engaging in making video or photos that are sexual in nature, they may not know that that person may be, for example, selling those online or sharing those with other people for some sort of exchange of value. So they may not even have enough information from what was going on in what they might perceive as an intimate or sexual relationship that for them might have been consensual for whatever reason, or an agreement or an arrangement that they feel like they were able to make. So there's a lot of overlap with some other types of interpersonal traumas. As mentioned earlier, they could have really complex feelings towards their exploiter. That could be, to repeat my phrase that I use a lot, the good, bad, and ugly. And I refer to the ugly as the icky parts that aren't necessarily blatantly bad, but not, clearly not the healthiest thing. And so that's why I use that sort of a parallel a lot of times. And so we want to consider that if we try to come on early on and come victim heavy, blaming the perpetrator heavy, that could impact their relationship, because at that point, there's a very good chance they might still have more trust in the trafficker and other people involved in the trafficking than they have in us, who might be the first time or the first few times we're meeting them. Maybe we spend a few hours with them, but why should they buy into us so much if we're just going to come off so judgmental or provide them information, again, that isn't just factual and meaningful for them? You know, the youth, sorry, go ahead. Thank you. There's also a benefit though. A lot of times what we like to do is just let them know, hey, you're going to be hearing these words. Whether there's an investigation or other things that are being documented once someone is flagged as having experienced trafficking or risk of trafficking. I just want you to understand what those words mean. So the benefit is that you have an opportunity, again, and a pathway to provide accurate information, and you could take the stance unless you're deeply embedded in those systems. You could be like, hey, I'm your therapist. I'm not the law enforcement officer. I'm not Child Protective Services. I'm not the judge. I'm not those entities here, but I do want you to understand what they might be talking to you about so that you're not completely lost or confused. And so you can make a decision for yourself, what you think of this information I'm going to provide for you. Common language for communicating about trafficking and experiences in therapy. By laying down some of the groundwork of what just basic vocabulary words, terminology, and definitions are, then you could also make sure that you're continuing to not make assumptions and that you're talking the same language and using the same language as you proceed with treatment. And so you want to make sure that you want to know that if you refer to trafficking, you're not necessarily convincing them that they've experienced trafficking or that they're a victim of trafficking, but they do know that there is a word called trafficking, there is a thing called trafficking, and this is what it means. A lot of, especially early on in treatment, leaning into just laws and definitions, which by nature are kind of these concrete things that neither you nor the individual you're working with can control. They're not going to change the law right now. We're not going to change the law right now. These are these words, these are these definitions. And kind of, it's also a way to kind of do gradual exposure to talking about this in a way that doesn't have to be accusatory or heavy or doom and gloom. We want to emphasize comfort and non-judgment with a non-judgment for us and comfort for them, which also means we should feel comfortable. Because a lot of times what throws people off is that when the worker, the clinician, is not feeling comfortable themselves, then they take some leaps of faith, maybe kind of like trying to assert something or convince. Maybe the youth isn't, or the caregiver isn't as receptive immediately, so they feel they're uncomfortable with that, so they push harder. So non-judgment from us, and we have to feel comfortable and demonstrate that so they can feel comfortable. This is an opportunity to normalize these experiences, feelings. So psychoeducation, I've talked quite a bit about definitions and laws and terminology and things like that, but also reactions, trauma responses, different types of feelings, including, being able to talk about ambivalence. Put it on the table when you're talking about feelings. And you have a lot of youth that don't know how to identify how something's affecting them because maybe they don't even know. But what you could be sure of is they probably have a lot of mixed feelings about different parts of it. And that it's not just that they have these one, two, or three feelings for each aspect of what's going on in their lives. If you are going to make an assumption, assume that there's probably some mixed feelings in there, and put on the table, what the concept of ambivalence is, that we could have contradicting feelings and beliefs at the same time, and it doesn't mean that one is right or one is wrong. When you have youth that have a history of missing from home on a regular basis or being involved with trafficking with the same exploiter over and over again, those are things that you could talk about too. And by kind of having these factual, not trying to convince you, comfortable for you and for them conversations early on, then this is a benefit of the early in treatment, that then now they might feel more comfortable being talking to you about when they might have a desire to reach out to the person or answer that phone call, when they get their phone back, or even just right now in the moment. Recognizing negative cognitions that contribute to high risk behaviors. No one takes care of me and keeps me safe. Only my boyfriend or exploiter. Denial. I would never do that because ... by putting the psychoeducation bits of it early on in those ways we've been describing, and this opportunity for them to maybe share some of those beliefs. So you might give them the definition, and you're not trying to convince them that what happened to them is trafficking, or that the person in their life is an abuser or trafficker. They're more likely to be able to then respond. And they might say, well, our relationship isn't abusive, or he's not abusive, or this isn't trafficking. And they could share with you what are their unhealthy or inaccurate cognitions or beliefs about the person, the people, plural, or the situation, that also then gives you an opportunity again to then think of what might be some other seeds you want to plant in terms of psychoeducation in future meetings and conversations. But ultimately, that you could have these conversations, including them denying or not being receptive to what you're saying, including that they might not identify with those things just yet. But then you could have conversations about the why and why not. Again, non-judgmentally, without the judging or the blaming or the stigma.
I'll just kind of add that middle one, and I think I maybe even asked to have it bolded because I feel like it's so important, about the comfort and non-judgment, because youth are expecting our judgment and discomfort. We have to demonstrate otherwise. We have to prove it to them, and it's really hard to do that if we're not actually talking about this topic. So talking about it in the factual ways like Ricardo's talking about are really, that's the pathway to demonstrating that we're comfortable with the topic, and we don't have judgment about it in the ways that they're expecting. And he was talking with this lack, even in their denials or explanations about why they're insistent it didn't happen, we get helpful information, and none of it has to, it's, I would never, I would never do that because, that's nasty. People who do that are nasty, right? We've learned really important information, none of which has to be challenged right away, but we can tag all that information and address it kind of as the relationship kind of will support it and as we continue to advance with them. But we can learn those things. We can learn about myths and facts that they might be holding, and know that those are things that we can address over time therapy. But we don't get that if we don't start introducing the topic. So I think to the next slide, how do we do that? This is a really common training and consultation question, maybe the most common. How do we do this with youth who are, denying that it's happened? I think it'd be pretty simple. Just starting off with an invitation to learn more about it without requiring they acknowledge that it's happened. So even things as simple as, I hear you, you're saying no trafficking or exploitation happened. Are you at least interested in why other people think so? What are you interested in at least what these terms even mean? That's a lot of words people are throwing at you. Are you interested in what the laws actually say about these things, right? Do you know anyone who has experienced it, right? So I think really just kind of simple invitations are a place to start. So, Ricardo, I don't know how you approach this with the youth.
And I'm trying not to be redundant with things that we've already shared, but if we could create an environment where we're Also, I'm going to piggyback. Another advantage of bringing up psychoeducation around treatment is kind of establishing that it's going to be a normal thing to sometimes provide information and things like that, and so that when you do, it's not going to be jarring or out of nowhere, or like you're trying to give a sudden lecture because maybe there was a recent risky situation. Being able to, and I really like with psychoeducation doing side by side activities, which Kelly spoke to also. It's not always like sitting across from someone, but the more that it could feel like this is a sort of team effort for understanding, could be really, really beneficial. When there's high risk situations, you're part of their team to help figure out how they could be safe and make sure they're okay. Again, with an emphasis that your interest is their well-being, not some ulterior motive, right? You know, when we have youth, and we're going to talk about caregivers quite a bit in a bit, So when I say youth, just assume we're talking about caregivers too, right? But when we're sitting side by side with an individual that could benefit from this, the more they could feel like you're on their side. And that doesn't mean that you have this ultimate full responsibility for protecting them from everything and teaching them everything possible or things like that. But the more that there's kind of like basic trauma-informed care principles, the more they could have a voice in things where things could be collaborative, where there's a mutuality involved. I find that these are some of the best things. So if it's for safety, we're both interested in their well-being. Same thing with the caregiver. I'm interested in your child's well-being. When it's just about having information, I'm on your team. I want you to understand what all this language and crazy stuff going on around you, these words you maybe have never heard of or don't understand, are about. We're talking about trauma and symptoms. We're on the same team in getting a baseline understanding in services and treatment that trauma happens to a lot of people. It's not just the one individual, that these are common trauma responses that people have. It's not unique to you. You work in this field long enough, you have a lot of youth that think, am I crazy? Or really believe that they're the only ones. And that makes it harder to even just digest that they've experienced a trauma, that it's having impacts in the case of trafficking, that it could be trafficking, because they're used to seeing what we all see oftentimes in the media and things like that. They're going to get those images from, whatever TV shows and movies that portray trafficking in a certain way. And automatically, for the most part, people would assume like, that doesn't happen to me. That doesn't happen to people in my neighborhood. That doesn't happen on my side of the track. And so how could you collaborate with them and address things so that they feel relatable in the grand scope of things? Because I could go on and on about this, and I know we're strapped a little bit for time, but presenting information that's in a relatable way that can continue to foster the relationship that you would have with this individual, knowing that your interest is not anything other than their well-being, and for them to have as much information as possible within the context that they're in, so that they can be okay and understand things and feel okay mentally, and hopefully be okay physically and in their surroundings.
So, what's really standing out to me about what you guys have been talking about is just how much clinical skill is involved in this. When you talk about how do you do it, it's very much a tuning to the youth and using the psychoeducation to facilitate engagement. In particular, making sure it's a collaborative process. So, for instance, you talked about creating opportunities for youth to share what they already know. And then you talked about making sure it's individualized. So, we obviously might create really different learning opportunities for, say, for instance, a 10-year-old autistic youth who has a special interest in video games. It might open an opportunity for psychoeducation versus, let's say, a pretty street savvy 17-year-old who's been supporting themselves for quite a while, but has recently experienced labor trafficking. The type of psychoeducation and the ways you do it might be different. But you also talked about a lot more subtle differences. So person to person, individual differences about preferences and learning styles and interests. And then you both highlighted, the thing that I think is really important, that the goal of psychoeducation is not to convince the youth that they were trafficked. So thinking about that stages of change framework, leaving space for the youth to slowly shift their perspective over time as they learn more. And keeping in mind at the same time, there's a benefit to providing some of that education around trafficking and what it is pretty early on to normalize, to create that comfort, make sure that the youth knows that you're comfortable with it, and to start just providing some common language around trafficking and exploitation. So let's dig a little bit more into some of the content and talk about what are some helpful topics to be prepared to address in psychoeducation with trafficked youth.
Okay, so obviously an important topic is trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Now, we're not going to go into detail for each of the elements that's listed here. This could be a webinar all on its own, but here are some elements that we think it's important to be prepared to address. And again, not elements will be necessary with all youth, but I just think it's important for therapists kind of in this space to be prepared. So definitely, yes, sex and labor trafficking and related terms, laws and rights, examples of common pathways, risk factors, pathways of entry, tying in ones that are, know what is suspected for the youth you're working with and make sure that those are included, but don't drill down so much on those, give them a broader perspective on the topic overall. They may know people who have other ways that they kind of were involved. But if they have a significant history of leaving placement and systems involvement in foster care, and that was a contributor, then we want to make sure that those things are in there. For example, common myths, especially if you suspect that there are some that are held by the youth. And then I think Ricardo's going to kind of talk about the things on the left side here, which I think are probably especially important in just addressing this topic with youth.
Yeah, one of the interesting things working with different types of abuse, but especially sexual abuse and trafficking specifically, is how much what our grooming tactics or recruitment activities overlap with what are everyday things of how we think things are supposed to happen. And that's why it's important to use that sort of psychoeducation on that area, because how a recruiter befriends someone, how an abuser or trafficker grooms someone can follow the tropes of how you make a friend, how someone becomes, at the very least, your acquaintance or associate, and also many times overlap with the themes embedded throughout our society in terms of what courtship should look like in a romantic relationship. If you really think about it, a lot of people really, really place value on someone being jealous and protective of you, with an emphasis on it seeming protective versus jealous, or also providing, buying things. All right. So if you have someone who's trying to groom someone into trafficking, it's very possible that's going to be way down the road of there being some controlling behaviors that will be perceived as they want to protect me versus jealousy or something, less desirable, or also things that may look like courtship processes of, oh, we go out and we do these things and they provide for me in some way, or they gifts and things like that. So it's very important for you to plant the seeds at the least when you're doing psychoeducation early on of how those things can be kind of tied into unhealthy relationships, even if someone has grown up believing that's what a healthy relationship might look like. Not to go into the other bullet points in as much depth, but the dynamics of power and control. For youth, we learn a lot about that stuff when we get our master's degrees or PhDs to become clinicians, what have you. That's not stuff that gets taught in school. So it's important to provide psychoeducation on these sorts of what are more clinical type concepts without having to make it too, professional jargon and make it relatable to the youth. We've already talked about the importance of experiences and their impacts. And then when you're working with someone long enough, you might come across, whether it's in safety planning or just because maybe their situation has legal process in place, to make sure that we provide psychoeducation on laws and rights of victims, and also what options they have in case they want to pursue any legal action or protect themselves when things come to that light.
Just to highlight a couple of resources that may be helpful. So these are some fact sheets developed by My Life, My Choice. They're freely accessible on their webpage. And they're specifically geared towards the one on the left for youth, the one on the right for parents. So I think they're good examples of just being able to use a pretty simple fact sheet to information that youth and caregivers can access relatively straightforwardly. The next one I think are these are the adapted from the power and control wheel from I think it's the Duluth Domestic Violence Intervention Project, and one on the left specific to trafficking, and another one developed that's kind of specifically more for teens. And what I like about these is that you can share them, and they may deny almost all of it, but even if they acknowledge, like, okay, sure, I don't love it when my boyfriend doesn't let me see my friends, that's a starting place, right, of conversation. I think all of the ways that we can take it to conversation is best. And then they cannot unknow everything else that they've seen on this wheel. So, putting the information out there, I think that these are really nice tools for being able to put some things out, even if they're not acknowledging all of it. All right. And then I think the next one is just sort of like, right now there are a number of places where there are libraries of online videos of individuals who have experienced trafficking, describing their experiences. There are several federal pages that have these libraries. Some anti-trafficking organizations will have some of these posted online. TED Talks. There's a number of really wonderful, thoughtful folks with lived experience of trafficking who have TED Talks talking about their experiences. Find ones that have features of the youth you're working with, their pathway and life experiences. I think it can be really kind of great places to start. And Cardona, if you have anything else to add, I know you have mentioned that your best resource is maybe sticky notes in the computer. So it doesn't have to be fancy like any of these things.
Yeah, sometimes, sometimes just exploring these types of websites together, but also just jotting something down, having something simple, So I think that's somewhere where we sometimes shoot ourselves in the foot, is we really try and provide too much information or too many resources. It's good to have that information and all those resources, but sometimes simple is better, in terms of, I've had individuals walk out with a piece of paper, or just, and by sticky notes, remember, if someone has a phone, there's notes in a phone. And a lot of the best psychoeducation that I've ever done sometimes have included someone in their sticky notes on their phone, their digital notes, if you will, having the website there to refer back to. So if you pull it up on your laptop, let's say, or what have you, it's also important to maybe have that sent to them via text so they have access to it. Or you have a good psychoeducation session, kind of highlight what are some things to revisit and note those things somewhere. We know that in therapy, when we give people homework assignments, the homework completion rate is not the most desirable. But if you could plant something in whatever way that they could kind of review, or at least think about afterwards, or that you could cling on to and have that in your notes, digital or sticky in real life, to refer back to when you meet with them again, then you could kind of continue with a flow of the conversation, and makes it less choppy as well.
And I will just add on to that, just also being attentive to safety issues. And of course, if there's an exploiter who has access to their phone or their computer or whatever, being attentive to those types of issues as well.
So we definitely wanted to lead with trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation as primary psychoed content, but backing up just a little bit, trafficked and exploited youth, they also need our bread and butter trauma psychoed too. Don't shortchange them on this, right? Because much of their trafficking risk, vulnerability, current difficulties are related to traumatic experiences other than trafficking. So we'll hit a few points of emphasis here, but again, for purpose of time, it's not a complete review of trauma psychoed. So, core area about therapy, mental health, and wellness. I think a point of emphasis here is about therapy. I think it's really important to be asking about their prior treatment experiences. Go ahead and advance, Elise. There we go. Youth have experiences they've just often had, as I said earlier, kind of multiple failed experiences of treatment. So we need to understand that. We need to normalize and validate the feelings they have about it, and to be prepared to kind of pitch how this treatment is going to be different, being as specific as possible. How we will do it different, that it will address their specific goals and needs. It's part of instilling hope for youth who might not have any. And we can't do that very well if we actually don't know what their private experiences were like and how they didn't work for them. I think this part is pretty important. So make sure we're asking about what their prior treatment experiences have been, maybe even before we're going to be explaining what we're going to be doing. Okay, and then I think again, trauma treatment, bread and butter. What is trauma? About PTSD, complex trauma. Go ahead and advance again. So yeah, these are some of the kind of common elements. So we want to be prepared to talk about these definitions and examples of trauma broadly, neurobiology, so trauma in the brain, educating about trauma reminders, PTSD symptoms and domains. I think especially avoidance, because it plays out so strongly and is often misunderstood by youth, our partners, parents, everything, and being prepared about complex trauma. And in terms of that link to regulation and safety, so oftentimes safety concerns with trafficked youth are born out of their best efforts to cope with dysregulation, and so substance use and leaving placement, for example, with trafficked youth. But that dysregulation may have started with a trauma reminder. So, and we talked about this in a bit more detail in the safety and regulation webinar a few months ago. But again, identifying trauma reminders and coping alternatives can be a pretty key strategy in achieving better safety, which is this other thing that's often presenting early in treatment. And sometimes that can be a thing that's getting in the way of other things. Actually kind of providing some education and understanding this link can be a pretty good pathway to achieving better safety. All right, Albert's a bit snarky here, but our point's that it's important to be able to explain things in simple terms. So like even this on the next slide, the very simple kind of graphic is a nice illustration of breaking down a wonky, wordy diagnosis into understandable terms. And I think we want to be prepared to do that with a lot of stuff that's actually kind of complicated. Like neurobiology is actually pretty complicated to talk about, right? So we want to get good at doing it in different levels of understanding and information for folks. All right, I think go ahead and advance. Just again, some resources that can be helpful here. So just in general about child trauma, I think the NCTSN webplace is a really great place to start, whether it's the webpage itself, fact sheets for different audiences and ages about trauma more broadly, a lot of webinars, videos, podcasts that are available on the page about, again, child trauma broadly, and then kind of particular elements that can be helpful. So on the left is a booklet about what is complex trauma that was developed, and then for caregivers, and then on the right is a video that were all developed by the NCTSN Youth and Young Advisory Board, and they're really, really cool resources for kind of explaining that to different folks. And then I think that there are, the next one I think is a video resource by partners of ours in the network at Northwestern University about trauma that's really great. And then there's just, so many non-NCTSN resources like this video about the brain that I just think can be really helpful in terms of being able to provide some of this basic trauma psychoeducation, some good places to start. I think that one other thing I'll touch on here is information about specific traumas, which is kind of often considered sort of, again, bedrock trauma psychoeducation. But here's the thing. Sometimes we therapists, and certainly our MDT partners and others, will view trafficking a little bit like this, like it's Mount Fuji, this monolithic thing. But for the youth, it's a bit more like the Rockies. Sure, trafficking is in there, but it's not the only trauma they've experienced. In fact, it's unlikely to be the thing that they identify as being the most upsetting or impactful thing that's happened to them. And assuming otherwise, and over-focusing on the trafficking is likely to be like a little bit of a disconnect to the youth's kind of own experience. So I think it's really important to be prepared to address other traumas they may have experienced. Like I said, they're often the ones that are most willing to acknowledge. They're often the ones that they're most ready to discuss with us. So again, try not to over-focus on the trafficking when there's so much else. And also because so many of these other traumas that have happened have been pretty significant contributors to their trafficking vulnerability and the challenge that they might be having right now. So this is a fairly long list of, what we consider to be important traumas for folks to be prepared to be able to talk about. Some that are especially common: child sexual abuse, traumatic loss and separation. But the fact of the matter is, studies put the average number of different kinds of trauma experienced at like 6 or even more. So, but go ahead and go to the next slide. I think this kind of begs the question, given that they've experienced so many different types of trauma, it can be pretty challenging to figure out kind of what to include. And this is maybe another especially common training and consultation question I get. What do you do when there has been so much trauma in their lives? And just some ideas on how therapists might be able to prioritize it. So first, I think, what we might know from screening and assessment. So if they've completed a standardized trauma measure like the UCLA that asks, what's the most upsetting? Let's be prepared to include that one in psychoeducation at some point. The other part might be, what do we know because they have told us or because we have observed or others have reported to be particularly connected to problems in functioning. So that can be like that are associated with significant trauma reminders, or maybe that they have especially strong negative thoughts about that are bound up in these other trauma experiences. We want to be prepared to address those traumas. And then finally, like engagement, again, that's kind of been a point. In the interest of youth engagement, if there's something that they say they're interested in learning about, even if it's not one that kind of would necessarily resonate with us, again, kind of not about us, let's do that for its engagement value and that interest of providing information that the youth is interested in. So I think those are kind of three things to think about as we're making decisions about which might be the traumas that we might want to prioritize to talk about. And again, I'll just kind of make the case that the NCTSN website is a really great place to start. There's a lot of information about specific different kinds of trauma experiences, some resources that are geared toward youth. I think all of these are specifically geared toward youth. Others that are geared more towards caregivers, or just other like really good fact sheets and more of a general sense. So Ricardo, I don't know if you have some other, here we go. You're muted.
I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to bounce along over here. Important related topics, and these are very common when you're dealing with other types of trauma. So this, we're not going to go too in depth here, but what is healthy sexuality? You might have to do psychoeducation on reproductive health. What are healthy or unhealthy relationships or relationships patterns? Again, always tread very, very lightly to not be like, too cookie cutter or, bringing your beliefs to these things. We want youth to just have an understanding. A lot of times youth, are exploring their sexuality in every sense possible. And, experiencing trafficking could really put a spin on that and make it challenging for them to understand themselves, but also they may have been in situations that are trafficking related where how their health was treated was impacted because, for example, going to the OBGYN or to an ER or a hospital or a clinic or any sort of medical setting could be a risk for those involved in the trafficking, in terms of that being flagged as a concern, due to repeated pregnancies, repeated STIs, or other things that are not even sexually specific that medical professionals might identify. Next slide. Sexual decision making is a really important thing. I mentioned earlier, kind of similarly, it's easier to learn a relaxation technique when you're not already upset in some way. I think it's important to have conversations about healthy relationships and more specifically sexual decision making when you're not in the moment of feeling pressured or and again, it's not, our services should conceptualize that a human being is a complex human being. Trauma is complex too, but we're providing psychoeducation, having conversations that are not always very specifically to trafficking, right? So just in general, if you're working with adolescents and young adults or preteens, you should probably be having conversations about healthy relationships and sexual decision making. And one of the things I like to encourage people to do is, just like you're not going to teach someone how to do a relaxation skill when they're about to get into a fight, you want to have conversations about sexual decision making, not when they're aroused or pressured by the other people there or whatever the circumstances may be, to have a thought process when they aren't influenced in those ways, to be able to think about what is it that I do or do not want to do within the context of this relationship or with this person. and kind of I use the phrase, where would I draw the line where I would maybe at this point say, hey, no, I don't want to do that or something like that. It's also an opportunity to practice, not just thinking about those things, but maybe even role playing how to respond to different things. Next slide, please. Substance use. A lot of times trafficking involves substance use either as a precursor and a vulnerability. It could be part of how someone copes with the trafficking or just like with other types of trauma, it could be forced upon them to make them more vulnerable to or incapacitated such that the exploitation and abuse can occur. Substance in labor trafficking, substance use could be part of getting someone to work all night or all weekend long without sleep, and so there are a lot of overlaps here where the three main points that substance use could be a pre vulnerability that leads to abuse and exploitation. Substance use could be a symptom of trauma that comes from any type of exploitation or trafficking. Substance use could be not always the most, sometimes maladaptive coping skill, not always the healthiest coping skill. And I say it that way because, again, I could have said it in a way that would have sounded much more judgmental and making assumptions there. So we have to be thoughtful about those things, but also sometimes individuals experience forced substance use. So those are just kind of the four prongs out there where substance use is related to psychoeducation. And again, emphasis here, not just related to trafficking. If you're working with individuals where there's physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, other things, there's a very good probability that substance use could have popped up in any way, in any of those ways. Of course, internet and social media. And this is, I have to say, doing this work for quite a bit, one of the more challenging things, because not a few months go by without there being something new, a new website, a new form of social media, something new, whether on the normal web or the dark web. So we know that a lot of youth today are being influenced through and meeting people and being groomed through social media and on the internet. I can't speak for all of you, but working with a lot of youth, especially post-pandemic, where things went very virtual, there's a lot of youth in education programs that are only online, and they could have one page up with the school app, and they could have another page up with social media, and another page up with another, website or something like that. And so there's always an increasing risk in that, and something that there's already education out there. I attended a webinar a while back from Love 146, who does the Not a Number curriculum, and it had to do with AI generated sexual imagery. So now as AI becomes a norm on people's phones and computers, that's going to become something that we're going to have to relearn in a sense. I don't know if relearn is the right word, but learn anew in terms of becoming, for lack of better words, as most expert as possible at what the risks and potential consequences of that are in the context of exploitation and trafficking. I think Kelly, this one bounces back to you, or is this me?
Only to point out another NCTSN resource that I think is very helpful for this having a sexual health conversation. This is about the 6 principles of sexual health. And if you read these and think in terms of trafficking, I think it's kind of relevance and resonance is good. I mean, the topics that are in this resource around consent, being non-exploitative, protection from STIs, HIV, and unplanned pregnancy, honesty, shared values, and mutual pleasure. And I think Ricardo has really touched on all of these already in different points. So I think that's a good resource to know about. I think these are online resources where you can go and get really great information about healthy relationships. And
so there's so many topics that we want to address, things like treatment and what it is and isn't, trauma, understanding trauma reactions, trafficking and exploitation. And then we talked about other related topics like healthy relationships, sexuality and sexual health, substance use, internet, and social media. And so because of the individual differences, there's going to be a lot of variability in how we're addressing each of these. So again, we're kind of coming back to that idea around those nuanced clinical skills to guide pacing and really arming youth with information that's relevant to safety and focusing on engaging youth and working collaboratively. So for instance, you talked about paying close attention to traumas that are identified by the youth as the most upsetting. Those that are related to the youth's current difficulties or topics that the youth just wants to talk about and prioritizing those areas. And so we just want to touch a little bit on caregivers. I know we're getting right up close to the end, but we want to at least mention we did have our whole last webinar was on caregivers, so please feel free to go back and review that for additional information, but just touching a little bit on caregivers here.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, and for the sake of time, think of everything we've talked about so far, whole last hour and 20 minutes or so of this webinar, and apply those same concepts to working with caregivers. Okay. We want to provide accurate information. We want to be able to connect with them, which can help reduce isolation through their connections and engagement, and being able to look to us as a resource or support. But sometimes psychoeducation is also providing them with other resources and supports too, not just limited to ourselves, because we may not always be available. So an opportunity to reduce isolation, really, again, whenever you're working with individuals, youth, adults, caregivers, what have you, it is so important to normalize their experiences and their responses, again, without blaming or shaming or judgment. And then once you have that comfortable rapport built and that safe comfort zone, it's an opportunity to then identify what are some unhelpful or inaccurate or unhealthy trauma or trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation related cognitions, because now they could share, knowing you're not going to judge them or just try and teach them something to correct what they're thinking. Now they could feel comfortable talking about it. Next slide. Remember that you're attending to both the youth and the caregiver, and that means that each may also have different individualized learning styles and needs, or communication styles and needs. Don't ever take for granted, as we very much know, how many caregivers have their own historical trauma and how much multi-generational trauma is a thing. And the trafficking may or may not bring up their past traumas, but don't take it lightly that the high-risk behaviors and situations going on with their child, or the trafficking specific situations and victimizations that have happened to their child, could be its own new trauma for a caregiver, who, generally speaking, we could debate on caregivers' different parenting skills and things like that. Generally speaking, most caregivers ultimately want the child to be okay, and so their child being harmed could be traumatic for them. If you multiply that times past traumas, then it's going to have a greater impact then. And if your focus of treatment is the child, you want to make sure that you still are a support and a resource, and provide supports and resources to the caregivers, and link them to outside people if you're not going to be their clinician as well. And again, we've talked about their past experiences in therapy, past experiences and symptoms. The caregivers, by definition, being older than the child, the minor, if you will, have more extensive histories many times with trauma and systems throughout the lifespan, just because math is mathing that way. So they've been with their 40 or 50 or 30 years old, and you're working with a 15 or 17 or 20-year-old, the caregivers statistically are more likely to have experienced, had more trauma exposures and different experiences with the systems. Also, if you're working with adults, I think that sometimes we take for granted to not explore what our caregiver people in adults' lives. I could speak for myself. My grandmother was a huge caregiver role for myself as a grandmother, as well as for my parents. And so when you have multi-generational families, you can have different layers there of who could be involved. So even if you're working with a non-minor, someone who is an adult, you might want to still consider who are caregiver type people in their lives that may be able to be part of your service provision. Next slide. Addressing treatment and engagement barriers early on is really important. Engagement is huge. Explore what are their concerns, what is meaningful for them, and know that it might be very behavioral in nature. Very many times people get referred for services due to behavioral issues and high-risk things that aren't necessarily trafficking specific. You want to figure out whatever is the hook for the caregiver, what matters to them, and could you align it with and link it with what is related to the trafficking? Absolutely. But don't go so trafficking heavy that the caregiver is like, I don't see this, or they decided to do that, and they might have their unhealthy or unhelpful thoughts about it. And then you lose them because you're focusing on that or trying to convince them of the child's victimization or something like that. What matters to the caregiver? and what matters to the caregiver. So you can emphasize then what is the importance of their involvement. So their child is important to them. What is happening to their child is important to them. Which part of it is more important for them, so that they could believe that their role in treatment isn't just a you fix my child thing, but we could work together collaboratively for the well-being of the child together. Next slide. Okay. Any adults, so I kind of alluded to this when talking about when we're working with young adults and not just minors, who are different people. If the person who's the primary caregiver in the home is not available due to work or other barriers, who is someone else that is a reliable source that is in a caregiver type role that you could include in your treatment? And consider the different, always again, the different individualized needs of the different adults and what is meaningful to them, so that you're approaching with them with something that's going to be a value of them for them to take home, which is also going to in turn be a reason for them to come back. Next slide. So we're not going to go through this in great detail, and I think we're almost at time now, but these are kind of standard things that you would find across the board with caregivers that happen with other types of trauma and abuse. I don't know if Kelly, you wanted to speak to any specific point on this slide.
My only thing here is that I'll be really quick about this. So we normalizing and destigmatizing, hallmark of kind of psychoed, and like I said, maybe not a great place to start with a youth who has not acknowledged, but can be really super valuable in engagement with caregivers. They often are feeling especially isolated. If we think there's isolation and experiences of child sexual abuse, really magnify that when your child has experienced trafficking. But they may be carrying around feelings and reactions that they might consider unacceptable to acknowledge. So, they might be feeling kind of ashamed or angry, or they may have their own abuse and exploitation experiences. And that they won't acknowledge, but if you see it on a worksheet that says common reactions, right, it right away it can sort of normalize that experience for them. And then also maybe they might be more willing to acknowledge and discuss the feelings that they're having with you, the therapist. So I think there's real value in putting that out there with caregivers. Again, some NCTS resources. There's so many that are geared specifically for caregivers that I think can be really helpful on the NCTSN webpage.
So we've talked about so many resources already. This is kind of some of the range of resources that you all have mentioned. We will be following up after this, sending out some resources, but there's some links of sites where you can access some of the resources that we talked about today. This is also a list of organizations that include resources on their website that might be helpful as well. This quote just sums up an important takeaway. Psychoeducation content is limited only by the imagination of the person seeking help and the ability of the psychological practitioner to be innovative and creative. So there's really no one right way to support learning for youth and families who've been impacted by trafficking. Just be creative and innovative and work collaboratively with the youth and families to support their safety, healing, and growth. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is the 5th in an 8-webinar series. So if you'd like to review the previous webinars in this series, you can access them on the NCCT YouTube page. There's a QR code on this slide that'll take you there, or you can look at the bottom of this slide for our YouTube account name. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, Kelly and Ricardo are going to be facilitating a clinical discussion group on psychoeducation next Thursday from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern. This group's going to be an opportunity to explore applications of today's webinar in your clinical work. So you can register with the QR code here or through the link that will be in the chat. And we're also going to be following up with an email with registration information for that, inviting you to identify resources that you have found helpful when engaging in psychoeducation with youth and families impacted by trafficking, so we can share resources with each other. So please come ready to consider your challenges and your successes. And thank you so much to both of you, Kelly and Ricardo, for sharing this really resource-rich webinar. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Please join our email list to stay aware of professional development opportunities available through the NCCT. Thank you again for joining, and have a wonderful day, everyone.